I want to talk about some true crime podcasts. I'm not someone who listens to a lot of audiobooks. I probably listen to 1 or 2 a month, but I am very into podcasts. I listened to Serial a couple years ago and I loved it, but for some reason I just didn't think about picking up more until this past year when I decided to make a list of all the podcasts I wanted to listen to in the upcoming year, and I ended up listening to a ton of them just in 1 month. I've probably listened to 20 or 30 true crime podcasts at this point from beginning to end, and I want to tell you about a couple of my favorites. I will say that because I'm relatively new to podcasts, I don't know what's actually popular and what's not. I know that you've probably heard of a lot of these before, and I just am unaware because Serial, obviously, I know was a phenomenon. I know that My Favorite Murder is very popular. Other than that, I don't know. I have no idea what's popular and what's unknown. These are just the ones that I've found and loved. The first podcast I listened to after Serial was In the Dark Season 1, and it is still stuck with me. A common thread you'll find throughout true crime podcasts is just how badly the police can fail you, and I think with In the Dark Season 1, that was one of the main takeaways from that podcast. It was just how badly the investigation was fucked up from the beginning. Season 1 focused on the disappearance of an 11-year-old boy named Jacob Wetterling in Minnesota. The case really focuses on this small town and all of the sexual assault that was happening to children nearby, and just, once again, how badly the police fucked up the investigation into all this. It really goes into the community and how it's been affected by this, especially children of that time. I just found myself completely engrossed in this and so livid so many times, and I feel like that's the true mark of a good podcast or a good documentary, is when it makes you feel all the things. The next podcast I want to talk about is Uncover, but specifically Season 1, which revolved around the cult NXIVM. Before going into this podcast, I had heard about NXIVM because, of course, when Keith Raniere was arrested, Allison Mack from Smallville was also arrested, and I remember that being a very big deal at the time. NXIVM, if you don't know, is a cult with Keith Raniere as the head. It actually resembled in a lot of ways Scientology, but there was also a very specific sexual component as well as branding involved in this cult. The thing that this season had going for it was that one of the people heavily involved with this cult, I don't know what to call it besides a cult, but they considered it a religion as well as a business of some sort. They believed they were providing wellness and workshops. One of the women who was very high up in this wellness exercise thing actually ended up being friends with the person who did this podcast. They were friends from childhood, and she was like, let me tell you my crazy ass story. And so because of the closest they shared, she was able to be so open about her experience with this. And I think that closeness and that openness is what made this season so compelling. Because you truly are getting a look, not only inside this cult, but inside the mind of someone who was a part of it, who explains just how she was lured in and why she was a part of it for so long. And I think that will never not be interesting. The next thing I want to talk about is Dr. Death. Now, this is one that I know is probably pretty popular already, but it's one of my favorite ones that I've listened to so far. Dr. Death is just about this doctor who was able to get away with so much crazy shit for so long just simply by being confident in the fact that he could do it. He ruined so many people's lives, so many people's health, because he was not smart enough or able enough to do the things he was doing. He had barely even been in surgeries, and yet he would say that he could take on these crazy life-altering surgeries that even some of the best doctors couldn't do. But he was like, yeah, I'm in there. And he was able to do it and get away with it, and hospitals would just like push him out, but would also cover up for him. And it was just the craziest story. I know that they're making a show based on this, and I can't wait to watch it. If you have not heard this somehow, you absolutely need to take a listen because it's just nuts what he was able to do. By far, my favorite true crime podcast that I think I've listened to was Cold. I just recently listened to this and I was blown away by just the entire story. Now, they tell you right in the beginning kind of where the story is going and how it's going to end. So you know going in just how dark it's going to get, but from that point on, they kind of go back to the beginning and tell the story in a linear fashion. This is the story of Josh and Susan Powell and how they met and everything that happened after that. Josh Powell, the man that the story is focused on, chronicled a lot of his own life, and I think that led to just so much information for this podcast. He was always doing video and audio journaling and diaries, and so you got to hear everything in his own words, which was just so creepy. The story involving Josh and Susan was sad enough all on its own, but then you get to the episode with Josh and the children, and even though you know it's coming, I can't tell you how badly that episode rips out your heart. I nearly had a panic attack just from the 911 call that they have in that episode of the podcast, because it was just so heartbreaking and so terrible. This is kind of a longer podcast, but you never feel like they're repeating information. You always feel like you're getting more and new stuff, which I think is really important, because I listened to Up and Vanished and I hated it because I just felt like we were repeating the same information over and over and over again, and it got on my nerves a lot. Whereas this one, because it's told in a linear fashion, you're always getting just new stuff. And like I said, because of the diary entries and stuff, there's just so much to go over and so much to look in depth in. And we kind of go back to the women he tried to date and the way he would try to control them, and you can see just how this is building up to be something terrible, because I mean, this is who he's always been. And it was terrible too to listen to how Susan knew something bad was coming, how she knew something wasn't right with her husband, but it also just, she was so devoted to her faith and to him and to the idea of not getting divorced that she put up with it, and in the end, of course, it cost her life. If you're gonna listen to any podcast, actually, it should be this one, because it was just so well done. And there was a part at the end too where the host talks about like believing women and looking out for women, because I mean, these types of things happen all the time, and that really was powerful as well. I can't even tell you the crazy ass story involving the dad too and his obsession with Susan, because that was its own entire thing. Not only does it go into Josh and what a controlling, terrible person he is, but it also looks into his family dynamic and the rest of the family, because so many of them have been through terrible things, and it's clearly affected them and made them into a toxic but tight-knit family, and it's just all so tragic. The next podcast I want to talk about is the one I most recently listened to, which is called Live and Die in LA. This is a very interesting podcast in the sense that it pretty much takes place from the moment someone disappears. This girl, Adaya Shabani, goes missing and asks this private investigator for help. The private investigator is friends with a reporter, so he asks him to get involved, and so they start making this podcast. And so they're making this podcast while searching for this woman. They start the podcast, I think, just like only a couple weeks after she goes missing. Actually, it might only be 1 week after she goes missing, I believe. So they're really getting the information and investigating this minute by minute after she goes missing. And they actually end up solving who's done it. It takes a lot of crazy turns and really unfortunate things, but yeah, they do. I just finished this, and they do end up solving who it is and proving that it was them, and it was just like really interesting to get to see that in-depth of a look into the investigative process. It was also a very interesting look, once again, into a pretty toxic family, and also just what fame and wanting fame can do to you. And the last podcast I have to talk to you about is Root of Evil. This podcast was about the Black Dahlia murder, which if you haven't heard of it, it's a murder that took place in 1947. So this was obviously a long time ago, and they've never found the murderer. Well, this podcast is about how one family thinks that they have found the murderer, and they think it's someone related to them. I know that this has been turned into a TV show with Chris Pine. I think it was called But this podcast was riveting and just so interesting. It sees two sisters who kind of break down their entire family history and explain just how they're connected to George Hodel, the man they think is responsible for the Black Dahlia murder. And I mean, by the end of the podcast, you are convinced that they are right, because I mean, they really go into detail just why they think this, and it makes sense. But it also just is about abuse in a family and what it can do to you. Because this isn't just one person. There's so many family members that they never even knew, and they all get to tell their own story in their own words, and it's just heartbreaking. My battery died, so it's been like an hour and a half, and I don't know what I was talking about when my battery died, so I'm just gonna end this video here. I hope you will check out some of these podcasts, and if you have any recommendations for me, please leave them below, because I'm always looking for more good true crime podcasts. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll come back in soon. Bye.